Very good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Saha Viryan Karavavaha Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma Dvishavahaihi. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Chaitanyam Sarvagam Sarvam Sarvabhutaguhashayam Yat Sarva Vishayatitam Tasmai Sarvavide Namaha. Om Parameshwara. Nice to, where are you? Nice to see you all this morning. Welcome to you. Also, welcome to our many students regularly watching these classes, attending these classes, I should say, online. We continue our study of Shankara's Upadesha Sahasri. This text I'm enjoying it more and more as we go through. We've been seeing, I hope you are too, we're just now completing a very, I think, challenging section in which Shankara took on the Buddhists, two main schools of Buddhism, Shunyavada, Vijnanavada, and he's refuting them very thoroughly, and that refutation ends. You have one more verse. Let me get the verse up. Why don't we recite the verse? And then I'll set the context, and we'll begin there. Sarupatvana sarvasya, sarupatvana sarva tyaktum shakyo hyayanyataha, tyaktum shakyo hyananyataha, grihitum vatato nityo, grihitum vatato nityo, vishayat prataktvatah, vishayatva prataktvatah. We'll explain the verse in just a minute. But let's get the context very clearly. We said before that the reason Buddhism is considered outside the Hindu tradition, even though he came up in a Hindu tradition and much of what he taught is completely consistent with Hindu teachings, the reason he lies outside is he rejected the authority of Scripture, which means everything taught in the Buddhist tradition traces its origin to Buddha, the person himself. And remember that in Buddha's time, he was not considered a god. He was not considered anything other than a human being, an enlightened human being, but a human being. For this reason, two important conclusions. One is all Buddhist teachings have their roots in human thought with its natural limitations. And secondly, from a Vedantic standpoint, they have chopped off one of the three legs of their table. Remember our three legs, Shruti, Yukti, Anubhava, Bhava. Everything we accept has to meet a threefold criteria, revealed in Scripture, supported by reasoning, and confirmed by personal experience. So we have a three-legged table, which is very stable. The Buddhists have chopped off one of those three legs, Shruti, and the table falls over, from our perspective. So, that means, and here's something that's significant from a purely Vedantic standpoint, not just in comparison to Buddhism. The fact that Atma is sat-chit-ananda, unborn, uncreated, boundaryless, limitless, full, complete, and so forth, that fact cannot be established merely by reasoning and personal experience. Can't. You try, I will pick it apart. It won't stand the test. we need a third leg, Shruti. The fact that there's an underlying reality called Brahman, because of which the entire universe exists, cannot be established purely by reasoning and experience. We need that third leg. And the fact that Atma and Brahman are the same reality, what to say? We cannot establish that on reason and experience alone. We need all three. The entire teachings of Vedanta are based on Shruti, Yukti, Anubhava. We cannot remove any three of these supports. And Buddhism has removed one. So they then lack an additional means of establishing the nature of Atma, the nature of Brahman, and the identity of the two. With that background, this verse will make a lot more sense. So this is Shankara's conclusion of his refutation of the Buddhists. He says, Sarupa Twat, because Atma/Brahman, one and the same reality ultimately. In fact, some Western scholars will abbreviate it, Atma-Brahman. We don't do that in Sanskrit, but it's done by some Western scholars. So that Atma, which is Brahman, Surupa Twat Sarvasya, because it is the essence of everything, there is only Brahman, Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. The Upanishad, Chandogya Upanishad says everything is nothing but Brahman. Or in my guru's words, there's not one God, there is only God, expressing exactly the same truth. So and that's what's expressed here. Sarupa Twat Sarvasya, because everything is that one reality. Na tyaktum shakyaha. It is not possible to refute Atma or Brahman, or their identity, anyataha, he indeed, ananyataha, as being separate. You cannot reject anything as being separate. There is only Brahman. This is the essence of Advaita. This is how, in spite of the fact that we talk so much about Atma, then we talk about Brahman, but ultimately, there are not two. There's not one Atma and one Brahman. There is one fundamental reality. So there is na ananyataha. There is nothing that is non-separate from that reality. There is nothing that na tyaktum shakyaha. It's not possible. Actually, let me get the Sanskrit a little bit more correct here. Na tyaktum shakyaha, it's not possible. Tyaktum shakyaha, grahitum va shakyaha. We have to make these connections. It's not possible to reject anything or accept anything. Grahitum. It's not possible to accept anything or reject anything because ananyataha, there's nothing separate. In order to accept something, duality is implied. That which is accepted and that which is accepting it. In order to reject something, there's a duality. That which is rejected and that whom is doing the rejecting. Who is doing the rejecting? So all of these dualities are ultimately negated. And what this points to is the limitations of Buddhist logic. Again, they remove that ability to call upon scriptural revelation. They're stuck with logic and their own experience. And logic and their own experience are fundamentally limited and cannot be extended into this realm of non-duality. It's an entirely higher order of discussion, higher order of reality. They can't reach it without help. They don't have the help of the scripture. And then Shankara concludes, tataha, therefore, last line, avishayatva aprataktvataha, because reality has avishayatva. It's not an object. Reality is not an object. That is such an interesting expression. Anything that's an object is not as real as the one who knows the object. This is Vedanta. We're not saying that it's an illusion. We're not saying that objects don't exist. We do say that anything perceived by you as an object is not a fundamental reality. The fundamental reality, that non-dual reality, is the observer and not the observed. And the second reason he gives, aprataktvataha, as he said before, there's nothing separate. Pratak, separate. Aprataktvataha. Because there is nothing separate, there is nothing independent, there is one fundamental reality. Here's Advaita. By the way, never say something like Advaita in a nutshell. People like that expression? What do you find inside a nutshell? Is that a good metaphor? So I'm not going to tell you what is Advaita in a nutshell. I will tell you Advaita very briefly. And very briefly, it's this. There is one fundamental reality that is manifest as a world of objects, and that is present in your experience right now as your own consciousness. Two aspects of that one fundamental reality. I'll say that one more time, and we'll move on. There is one fundamental reality, Shankara here calls it nityaha, that eternal fundamental reality. That eternal fundamental reality gives existence to all objects and is present in your experience as your own consciousness. I don't think Vedanta could be expressed any more briefly than that. Okay, with that verse, we come to the end of Shankara's refutation of Buddhism. This is verse 42. As we continue, we jump to verse 47. How did we jump to verse 47? You remember?
It's 57.
Yeah, 57. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. How did we jump to verse 57? You remember that starting with this chapter, we're starting to choose certain sections to leave out that get really very we're not leaving them out. You know, I want to correct myself. I said before, we're leaving them out because they're technical. Well, what we just saw, that refutation of Buddhism was quite technical. It was very sophisticated. We are leaving out things not because you can't understand them. That's not the point. We're leaving things out because you haven't had the background to understand them properly. And let me explain that. In the verses we're leaving out, from verse 43 to 56, verses 43 and 44 are a refutation of karma mimamsa. Have you studied mimamsa thoroughly? Jaimini Sutras. Verses 45 to 50 are a refutation of Sankhya Mata. And verses 52 to 56 are a refutation of Vaisheshika Mata. These are, I think I may have, if I misspoke before, I apologize. You are absolutely capable of understanding all of this, but it's a whole class. Not whole class, it's a whole course to understand what is Sankhya Mata, what is Mimamsaka Mata, what is Vaisheshika Mata. And I'm not sure we want to devote ourselves that much to other schools of thought. We want to stay focused on Advaita Vedanta. So for this reason, we are skipping over those sections, which is In Shankara's time, it was perhaps more relevant. People reading Shankara's texts, for hundreds of years after he lived, they were all deeply immersed in this culture, which had scholars studying these other, Vaisheshika, Sankhya, and other schools of thought. In modern times, it's not an issue, which is why we devote a little time. We devote extra time that Shankara doesn't devote time to. We devote time to refuting teachings of neuroscience, which say that the consciousness is a product of the brain. That was not an issue in Shankara's time. No one imagined that consciousness could be produced by the brain. But in our age, plenty of scientists are convinced that consciousness is produced, or it's an epiphenomenon. It's a side effect of the brain's activity. This is a modern school of thought that we must address, and we address it again and again in appropriate places, which means not here. So, schools of thought which are irrelevant to us, we skip over. Mimamsa, Sankhya, Vaisheshika, but issues that are relevant to us, we jump into. So here, with the next verse, we return to Shankara's main topic throughout the Upadesha Sahasri, focusing on the nature of Atma, the nature of moksha, and we're back to something we discussed before, that moksha is not a state. There is no state of bondage, there is no state of moksha. Let's see the verse and we'll continue with that. Anavastantaratvacha, anavastantaratvacha, bandho natmani vidyate, bandho natmani vidyate, na shuddhischapya sangatvat, na shuddhischapya sangatvat, asango hiti cha shrutehe, sango hiti cha shrutehe. All right. Anavastha antaratvat cha bandaha na atmani vidyate. Bandaha, bondage, atmani, in atma, for atma, with regard to atma, na vidyate. Atma has no bondage. Why? You don't have to tell me out loud. You should be able to answer that question if you've attended our prior classes. Why can we say so clearly there is no bondage for Atma? Atma is a fundamental reality, an unchanging fundamental reality. If Atma starts out bound, it's forever bound. So therefore, na bandha vidyate, there is no bondage for Atma. Why? Anavastha antaratvat. Because there is no avastha antara, there is no other state, avastha, no other state for Atma. Atma is an unchanging fundamental reality. That which is an unchanging fundamental reality doesn't change. Fundamental realities don't change, even in science. Gravity, for scientists, is a fundamental reality. It doesn't change, which is a good thing, because you can imagine if objects start falling up or sideways, our lives would be pretty confusing. Fundamental realities do not change. The consciousness present in your experience right now is a fundamental reality. It doesn't change. It seems to change for a lot of reasons we've discussed in prior classes, but really speaking, the consciousness present in your experience right this moment is an unchanging fundamental reality. Therefore, na bandha, there is no bondage for that unchanging reality. Of course, the flip side of it means there's no moksha either. If Atma doesn't get bound because it's unchanging, Atma can't be liberated because it's unchanging. We've had this discussion before. It's not a problem, but it looks like a problem. If Atma doesn't undergo change, then how does Atma become liberated? You probably know the answer to that question. Atma is nitya mukta, eternally liberated, never got into a state of bondage in the first place. But that's going to be the source of an objection that will come in the next verse. So Shankara says here, there's no bondage for Atma. In the next verse, we're going to see an objection. Wait a minute. If there's no bondage, there's no moksha either if Atma is unchanging. We'll see that objection in the next verse. Let's finish this one. So for that Atma, na ashuddhihi api asangatvat. For that Atma, na ashuddhihi. There is no impurity. Atma, it goes back to what I just said. Atma seems to be changing in your experience. Atma seems to be affected by whatever happens in your mind. Your mind becomes happy, you say, I am happy. Your mind becomes sad, you say, I am sad. It means your consciousness seems to go through states of happiness or sadness, and as we've discussed in this class many, many times before, if you want to call anything an illusion, that is an illusion. It's an illusion that your consciousness changes. The example we've seen so many times is the orangeness of this cloth doesn't really affect the crystal. The crystal looks orange. You experience an orange crystal. You can't deny that. You experience an orange crystal. Experiences are misleading. Like the sunset example I've given so many times before, the sun doesn't go down, the earth turns. Experiences are misleading. They have to be properly understood. You have to understand that in spite of the appearance of orangeness in this crystal, the crystal is utterly shuddha, utterly pure, utterly unaffected by the color of this cloth. In the same way, your mind is like this clear crystal. It appears colored. Your consciousness is utterly unaffected like this crystal. It appears colored due to the, like cloth is orange, mind is sad. In the presence of an orange cloth, crystal appears orange. In the presence of a sad mind, consciousness seems sad. That's an excellent metaphor, used all the time. Although they usually use a red flower instead of orange cloth. So here's the thing. Atma is there's na ashuddhihi. The idea is that Atma, our last class we discussed 4 kinds of change, and one of them was transformation. Atma doesn't need to undergo any kind of transformation. Atma is already pure. Na ashuddhihi, for Atma, api. Why? Asangatvat. Because Atma has no relationship with anything else. That word asanga is a crucial word in Advaita Vedanta and is often misunderstood. This is sangha. That's asanga. It's really that simple. Or better put, this is a sangha. This is sangha. And this is a sangha. Here, asanga means many literal definitions. Is there any real contact between crystal and cloth? A sangha. This is sangha. But there's no real contact at all. because there's no real contact, the color of the cloth can't really affect the crystal. That's the idea here. So, asangatvat. And then he gives a reference from scripture. Asango hi iti cha shutehe. And also this is supported not just by reasoning. So far we've been using a lot of reasoning. He says it's all, and experience. I said your experience of the orange crystal is misleading. So notice that we used both experience, we analyzed your experience, and we used reasoning in the form of that analysis. And now we're using scripture, shutehe, according to scripture, asangaha hi. This is a reference to a famous passage from the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. I'll just share a little bit of it. It says, sa esha neti neti iti atma. Atma is known through negation, neti neti. Agrihyaha nahi grihyate. Because atma cannot be grasped, agrihyate. No one can grasp it. Because atma is a shiryaha, atma can't decay, therefore nahi shiryate. No one can hurt it, no one can decompose it. And here's the quotation, asangaha hi, because atma has no connection to anything else, nahi sajyate. It can't be touched by anything. It can't be tainted by anything. Asitaha, because atma can't be harmed, can't be changed. Na vyatate, it can't be disturbed. No one can disturb atma. This passage goes on. I'm laughing because the end of this passage is ridiculous. What to say? This is an argument between the great rishi Yajnavalkya and an opponent in a debate called Shakalya. And Shakalya is kind of a rude guy and really, very argumentative with Yajnavalkya, not very respectful. And again, we could say that the argument must have gotten quite heated, it appears. And Yajnavalkya ends up saying, Tam cha ime na vivakshyasi. If you don't, this is Yajnavalkya talking to Shakalya at the end of this heated argument. He says, if you don't understand this properly, murdha te viparitishyati. Murdha, head. Your head, viparitishyati, will fall off. Your head will fall off, and anyway, we'll leave it there. This is kind of an ancient form of argument. I think Gargi uses the same kind of expression when she argues. Your head will fall off. Must have been a common expression back in those days. We don't use anything like that. Anyway, this is the expression from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So this is our third support. Atma is an unchanging fundamental reality according to scripture, asangahi, according to reasoning, that which reveals your constantly changing thoughts should be unchanging, unmoving. And finally, experience. The experience of change can easily be deconstructed, like the orange crystal, like the sunset. So any experience to the contrary can easily be addressed. Okay. By the way, this verse is not complete. It completes in the first half of this next verse. The sentence, I should say, completes in the first half of the next verse. Sukshmai ka gochare bhyascha. Sukshmai ka gochare moksha na lipyata yati shutehe na lipyata yati shutehe evam tarhi na mokshosti evam tarhi na mokshosti bandha bhavat katanchana bandha bhavat katanchana. So he's giving further reasons that Atma is an unchanging fundamental reality. More reasons: sukshma eka agocharebhyaha. Also, because of Atma being sukshma, subtle, it's not an object. One object can be affected by another object. Atma is eka sukshma. It is one non-physical reality, and it is agochara, imperceptible. Atma is not an object in the world. Objects in the world get affected by everything. Our bodies are objects in the world, subject to lots of problems. Our minds are objects in the world, subject to lots of problems. Atma is not an object in the world. Atma is a fundamental reality, unchanging fundamental reality, and gives further a scriptural support for that. Na lipyate iti shutehe. So this is a reference. Atma is na lipyate, is not affected, is not tainted. This is a reference to a verse in the Katha Upanishad. Gives a beautiful metaphor. Suryaha yatha suryalokasya chakshuhu na lipyate. There's the quotation. Chakshushaihi bahyadosaihi. Just like the sun does not get affected by whatever it shines upon, it reveals everything without being affected by what it reveals. In the same way, ekas tata sarva bhutantaratma, in the same way that one indwelling self, that one consciousness which is present in all beings, na lipyate lokadukena bahyaha, is not tainted, is not affected in any way whatsoever by the problems of the world. The sun shines, the example I've given so many times before, the sun shines on a pile of filth, stinking filth. The sun doesn't get affected at all. That's the idea. Okay. That topic concludes with an objection. So here the objection, by the way, is not from the Buddhists, nor is it from the Sankhya's, nor is it from the Vaisheshikas. This objection comes from Shankara himself. This is the style. It's a more common style in commentaries, but occasionally this style is used in the midst of a text. It's a style in which the author brings out a possible objection. And that possible objection need not be from any particular school of thought. It's an objection inserted by Shankara himself for the sake of clarification. And here the objection is evam tarhi. So he puts these words in the mouth of an objector. In Sanskrit, the objector is called purva pakshi. Purva pakshi is the opponent. The one in the purva here means opposite. Paksha means like school of thought. Somebody who's in an opposing school of thought is a purva pakshi. So the purva pakshi says, evam tarhi, if that is so, if Atma is an unchanging reality, then na moksha asti. Then Atma can't gain liberation. If Atma is unchanging, Atma can't be liberated. Liberated from what? Bandha abhavat. Can't be liberated there's no moksha for atma. Why? Bandha abhavat, because there's no bondage for atma. In fact, the argument that let me connect the argument properly for you. Shankara has just established that this unchanging consciousness is utterly unaffected by the problems of the world. Well, the problems of the world is called samsara, and samsara is the cause for bandha, bondage. So Shankara has just established that because Atma remains utterly unaffected by the problems of the world, therefore Atma is independent of the samsara, unaffected by samsara, therefore Atma has no bandha, no bondage. And that's what the objector says. Then bandha abhavat katanchana, then because there is no bondage, then for that reason also, there are two arguments going on here. One is if Atma is unchanging, it can't gain moksha. And secondly, if Atma is free from contact, free from being tainted by worldly problems, then there is no bondage for Atma. There is neither moksha nor bondage for Atma. And by the way, the objector isn't done. He continues for one more line. By the way, sentences, a verse is not a sentence. This is a little bit of Sanskrit that you should know. Sentences can begin or end anywhere in a verse. A verse is a metrical unit. There are eight syllables in a quarter. And where sentences begin and end has no connection whatsoever to this metrical structure. So let's see the end of the Purva Pakshi in the next verse. Shasranartakyameva syan, Shasranartakyameva syan, na buddhir bhrantirishyate, na buddhir bhrantirishyate, bandho mokshaschatanashaha, bandho mokshaschatanashaha, sayatokto nachanyata, sayatokto nachanyata. So the Purva Pakshi, then he really wants us to, of course, to remember the Purva Paksha is Shankara. But here, Shankara puts in the mouth of the Purva Pakshi some really stabbing words. And the stabbing words is that if there is no bondage or moksha for Atma, the Purva Pakshi concludes, then Shastra anartikyam evam syat. Then the scriptures would have anartikyam, uselessness. If there's no bondage or moksha, what's the point? What are we doing here in our class? What is the purpose of the scriptures? What is the purpose of Upadesha Sahasri? If Atma doesn't get bound, if Atma doesn't get freed, what's the point of all this? Shastra anartikyam is a common argument. Scriptures are useless. And Shankara's style is nice, almost always. He begins with a short answer and then gives you a more elaborate answer. That's Shankara's style. His short answer is one word, na. You cannot say that the scriptures are useless. That's the short answer. Now comes the more elaborate answer. The more elaborate answer is bandhaha in the second line. Bandhaha, bondage, back up to the second line, ishyate, is understood as buddhehe bhrantihi, delusion of the mind. Bondage is a problem not of Atma. Bondage is a problem that belongs to the mind. bondage in particular is a form of delusion in the mind that makes you suffer. Specifically, that form of delusion, to use my guru's words, self-non-recognition, failing to recognize your true nature as sat-chit-ananda atma, failing to recognize that inner divinity, which is the essence of who you are, due to that particular delusion which lies in the mind, that is bandha, the source of bondage. So the bondage occurs not because of a problem of atma. Atma has no problem. Mind has a problem, which is good news, because if atma has a problem, and atma is unchanging, right? You get it? If atma has a problem, and atma is unchanging, you're stuck. Eternally stuck. So, fortunately, that's not the case. The problem belongs to the mind. And the famous statement, mana eva manushyanam karanam bandha mokshayoho. The cause of bondage and moksha for all human beings is manas eva. It is the mind. And that's what Shankara is saying here. So bondage is due to the presence of ignorance in your mind, and mokshaha cha tanashaha. The tanashaha, the destruction of that ignorance, is mokshaha. Many people object to this because what he's saying is the famous statement of Shankara, jnanameva mokshaha. Moksha is knowledge alone. And many people don't like that. What do you mean? Mere knowledge. Well, it's not mere. No, Shankara doesn't say mere knowledge is moksha. You've added that word mere knowledge when you make that objection. This isn't mere knowledge. This is brahmatma sakshatkara, the immediate recognition of your true nature as atma being non-separate from Brahman. That's not mere knowledge. And further, that's one half of the response to someone who says mere knowledge. It's not mere knowledge. But then the objection goes on, how can anything in your mind create liberation? And the answer is pretty obvious. That's what Shankara just said. If the problem is in the mind, where would the solution be? Nowhere else. I'm smiling, remembering my guru's words. People will say, but it's intellectual knowledge. It's knowledge in your mind. And Puja Swamiji would reply, is there any other kind of knowledge in addition to intellectual knowledge? Is there such a thing as nasal knowledge? His exact words. There's no other kind of knowledge, nor is any other kind of knowledge necessary. The problem is ignorance in the mind. The solution is the destruction of that ignorance, and that destruction of ignorance is moksha. Moksha cha tanashaha. Moksha is the destruction of ignorance, that particular ignorance which is like the so-called veil that covers your true nature. That particular ignorance has to be removed. Saha tata uktaha. Shankara wants to get out of this argument very quickly. He says, we've already talked about this. Tata yata uktaha, as discussed before. Saha, that is what we discussed before. Nacha anyata, and it's not anything different. It's exactly the same earlier in this chapter. In fact, I made a note here, back in verse 17, if you want to go back and look at verse 17, you'll find that it's already been discussed. Okay, moving on. Related topic. Bodhatma jyotisha deepta, bodhatma jyotisha deepta, bodham atmani manyate, bodham atmani manyate, buddhir ananyosti, buddhir nanyosti bodheti, buddhir nanyosti bodheti, seyam brantir hidhigata, seyam brantir hidhigata. The connection here is about that bhranti. Bhranti means ignorance, wrong thinking, confusion, wrong conclusions, which are the source of suffering. And he wants to explain what is that wrong conclusion that leads to suffering. What is that bhranti? So in the prior verse, Shankara says that bhranti, confusion in your mind, is the cause for bandha, bondage and suffering. And remove that and you gain moksha. But what is that bhranti? He wants to make that very clear in this verse. Start in the third line, talking about buddhihi, the mind, the intellect. So that mind, which is, now back up at the top, that buddhi is deepta. It is illumined. Illumined by what? Bodha atma jyotisha. It is illumined by the jyotish, by the light of atma, which is bodha. Here bodha means consciousness. Often means knowledge. Here it means just consciousness. So your intellect is illumined by the light of consciousness. But the problem is that buddhihi, the mind, now in the second line, that buddhi, bodham atmani manyate. Your mind, manyate, considers that bodham, consciousness, is atmani. It is mine. Your mind assumes that consciousness belongs to the mind. That sounds a little abstract, so let's try to make sense of it. In your mind is our ahankara, that I thought, the self-referential thought, the self-defining thought, the thought that says I am. And it's a thought. Remember, we've talked about it having a whole biography associated with it. It's a thought that defines who you are, and it's just a thought. And like any thought, it belongs to your mind, right? So when you say, I am conscious, think about that. When you say, I am conscious, the thought is declaring that it's consciousness. And here's the problem. When you have the thought, I am consciousness, is that thought known to you or not? Known to you. How is it known to you? You're conscious of it. You say, I am conscious. And that thought is representing itself as not being a thought. In fact, I used a funny expression once. I said, the ahankara is a thought masquerading as consciousness. It's like somebody with severe mental illness who goes around saying, I am God, I am God. You know, it's absurd. But that's exactly what happens. And it's not surprising because we got this. We have confusion born of proximity. This is something I don't think I've taught, at least not in this text. Maybe long ago I taught. So notice that it's the proximity of the crystal to the cloth that gives rise to confusion. Wouldn't it be the case that more proximity means closeness. The closer it gets, the harder it is to discern the difference. Make sense? Obviously, if it's very far away, it's easy. But the closer it gets, the harder it is to discern the difference between the orangeness of the cloth and the clarity of the crystal. So to show you something else, to show you this in a much more maximum proximity case, there's a classical example which I haven't given, I don't think, for years, but it's a very important metaphor given in the teachings of Advaita Vedanta. Does iron shine? I'm looking for anything made of metal. I don't see anything. That's okay. So if I had an iron rod in my hand, would it glow in the dark? No, iron doesn't glow in the dark. But suppose you heat that iron rod up to, I don't know, 1,000 degrees. I don't know exactly if there's temperatures for all of this stuff. I don't know what it would be, but let's just suppose. You heat up, by the way, not the whole iron rod, or you can't hold on to it. So you just heat up the tip of that iron rod to 1,000 degrees, so I can still hold on to it, and now the tip is heated to 1,000 degrees. It shines. Iron shines. I thought we said iron doesn't shine. The presence of heat, watch this. It's not that the iron shines, but due to the presence of heat, iron seems to shine. Iron is not a source of light. Heat, energy, is a source of light. But when you see that shining tip of that iron rod, you naturally assume that the iron is shining. How to separate out? What is the distance between the heat and the iron? So this is the difference. So in this metaphor, there's some distance involved. What is the distance between heat and rod in this metaphor? No distance whatsoever. They're absolutely, I guess a fancy word would be interpenetrating. They are just one and the same. That's the situation with the buddhi and consciousness. Buddhi is represented by the iron rod, consciousness represented by the heat. There's no distance whatsoever between the two, and it gives rise to the illusion, like the presence of heat gives rise to the illusion that the rod is shining. The presence of consciousness gives rise to the illusion that your mind is a conscious thing. It's not. Just like the rod doesn't shine on its own, your mind is a thing, and things are not conscious. But due to the presence of consciousness, your mind seems like a conscious thing. Your mind seems sentient. Who would say my mind is not conscious? Who would say that? No one would say that, except me. Somebody who's really immersed in these teachings would say your mind is stuff, just like your body is made of physical stuff, your mind is made of subtle stuff, and stuff isn't conscious. So I would say mind is insentient. How's that? And Vedantically speaking, it's absolutely true. There is sentiency, but sentiency is due to the combination. By the way, energy in space doesn't shine. Light passing through outer space, if you look at if you're in a rocket ship going out there, the sun is shining, but when you look, I gave this example before. I like this. Suppose they're up there in this what do they call it? Space station. They're circling the world. So if they look at the sun, they see the sunshine. If they look away from the sun, The sun is shining, emitting light in that direction. Wherever they look away from the sun shines in all directions. So when they look away from the sun, light is filling the sky. What color do they see? Black. Blackness of space. Light fills space, but isn't manifest until it hits something and gets reflected. So the fact is that space is full of light, but you don't see it. This is a good metaphor for consciousness. Consciousness fills the cosmos, but is reflected by your mind. I think there was another point I was trying to make. It ran away from me. That happens. So let's finish this. Let's come back to the verse. So the buddhi, the mind, manyate, considers bodham atmani. The mind says, I am conscious. And that is the beginning of the problem, not the beginning of the end. It's the beginning of the start, the start of suffering. It's to use simple language, it's identification with your mind. When the mind is happy, I am happy. When the mind is sad, I am sad. This is a formula for misery. Your mind is bound to be going up and down every day of your life. As long as you are identified with that mind, you're in for roller coaster ride. Some people like roller coasters. I would throw up. Just not for me. So this is the problem, the central problem we've discussed in many other classes, identification with the mind. But look at that new metaphor we've used. I think for the first time in this text, that iron rod shows how the thing we call mind, because it's permeated by consciousness, it seems like you, a conscious being. But that mind is not. And look at the problem of discernment, just to finish up this metaphor. It's easier to discern things which are further away. But what is the distance again? Between heat and rod. No distance. Makes it much harder to discern. Which means, if it were easy, Upadesha wouldn't be Upadesha Sahasri, it would be Upadesha Ekaha. There wouldn't be 1,000 verses. There would be one verse. That would be all we need if it were so simple. But this discernment is not so simple, which is why Shankara takes all this time. And he concludes then, Sa iyam bhrantihi, that bhranti, that confusion, the source of suffering, the source of bondage, he indeed dhigata, is present in your mind. The problem, the locus of the problem is your mind. The locus of the solution is your mind, which is why people will argue why these teachings of Vedanta are so intellectual. There we go again. The problem is in your mind. And here, let me just make one further reference and we'll wrap up our class. Our minds are pretty powerful. And I'm being kind of sarcastic. Our minds are extraordinarily powerful. Meaning that our knowledge is extraordinarily powerful, and our confusion is extraordinarily powerful. You can't deny it. Everything about our minds is just amazing, the power, the capacity. So if our capacity to understand is so intense, then the confusion our minds undergo must be equally intense, equally powerful. And for that powerful confusion, we need Upadesha Sahasri, thousands. Upadesha Ekaha won't be nearly enough. Okay, we'll end here. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso Ma Jyotirgamaya Mrityor Ma Amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat. Very nice. What am I doing here?